Good morning. This is a live reading of the Left Behind series. We are on the second book, The Tribulation Force. We're reading chapter 18 today, and I will begin to read now. 18 months later. It was frigid in Chicago. Rayford Steele pulled his heavy parka out of the closet. He hated lugging it through the airport, but he needed it just to get from the house to the car and from the car to the terminal. For months it had been all he could do to look at himself in the mirror while dressing for work. Often he packed his Global Community One captain's uniform with its gaudy gold braids and buttons on a background of navy. In truth, it would have been a snappy-looking and only slightly formal and pompous uniform had it not been such a stark reminder that he was working for the devil. The strain of living in Chicago while flying out of New York showed on Rayford's face. "I'm worried about you, Dad," Chloe had said more than once. She had even offered to move with him to New York, especially after Buck had relocated there a few months before. Rayford knew Chloe and Buck missed each other terribly, but he had his own reasons for wanting to stay in Chicago for as long as possible, not the least of which was Amanda White. "I'll be married before you will if Buck doesn't get on the ball. Has he even held your hand yet?" Chloe blushed. "Wouldn't you like to know? This is just all new to him, Dad. He's never been in love before." "And you have?" "I thought I had been until Buck. We've talked about the future and everything. He just hasn't popped the question." Rayford put on his cap and stood before the mirror, parka slung over his shoulder. He made a face, sighed, and shook his head. "We close on this house 2 weeks from tomorrow," he said, "and then you either come with me to New Babylon or you're on your own. Buck could sure make life easier for all of us by being a little decisive." "I'm not going to push him, Dad. Being apart has been a good test, and I hate the idea of leaving Bruce alone at New Hope." "Bruce is hardly alone. The church is bigger than it's ever been, and the underground shelter won't be much of a secret for long. It must be bigger than the sanctuary." Bruce Barnes had done his share of traveling too. He had instituted a program of house churches, small groups that met all over the suburbs and throughout the state in anticipation of the day when the assembling of the saints would be outlawed. It wouldn't be long. Bruce had gone all over the world, multiplying the small group ministry, starting in Israel, and seeing the ministry of the two witnesses and Rabbi Tyson ben Judah swell to fill the largest stadiums on the globe. The 144,000 Jewish evangelists were represented in every country, often infiltrating colleges and universities. Millions and millions had become believers, but as faith had grown, crime and mayhem had increased as well. Already there was pressure from the Global Community North American Government outpost in Washington, D.C., to convert all churches into official branches of what was now called Enigma Babylon One World Faith. The One World religion was headed by the new Pope Peter, formerly Peter Matthews of the United States. He had ushered in what he called a new era of tolerance and unity among the major religions. The biggest enemy of Enigma Babylon, which had taken over the Vatican as its headquarters, were the millions of people who believed that Jesus was the only way to God. To say arbitrarily, Pontifex Maximus Peter wrote in an official Enigma Babylon declaration that the Jewish and Protestant Bible, containing only the Old and New Testaments, is the final authority for faith and practice. Represents the height of intolerance and disunity. It flies in the face of all we have accomplished, and adherents to the false doctrine are hereby considered heretics. Pontifex Maximus Peter had lumped the Orthodox Jews and the new Christian believers together. He had as much problem with a newly rebuilt temple and its return to the system of sacrifices as he did with the millions and millions of converts to Christ. And ironically, the Supreme Pontiff had strange bedfellows in opposing the new temple. Eli and Moshe, the now world-famous witnesses whom no one dared oppose, often spoke out against the temple, but their logic was an anthemum to Enigma Babylon. Israel has rebuilt the temple to hasten the return of their Messiah, Eli and Moshe had said, not realizing that she built it apart from the true Messiah, who has already come. Israel has constructed a temple of rejection. Do not wonder why so few of the 144,000 Jewish evangelists are from Israel. Israel remains largely unbelieving and will soon suffer for it. The witnesses had been ablaze with anger the day the temple was dedicated and presented to the world. Hundreds of thousands began streaming to Jerusalem to see it. Nearly as many as had begun pilgrimages to New Babylon to see the magnificent new global community headquarters Nikolai Carpathia had designed. Eli and Moshe had angered everyone, including the visiting Carpathia the day of the celebration of the reopening of the temple. For the first time they had preached other than at the Wailing Wall or at a huge stadium. That day they waited until the temple was full, and thousands more filled the temple mount shoulder to shoulder. Moshe and Eli made their way to the temple side of the Golden Gate. Much to the consternation of the crowd, they were jeered and hissed and booed, but no one dared approach, let alone try to harm them. Nikolai Carpathia had been among the cadre of dignitaries that day. He railed against the interlopers, but Eli and Moshe silenced even him. Without the aid of microphones, the two witnesses spoke loudly enough for all to hear, crying out in the courtyard, Nikolai, you yourself will one day defile and desecrate this temple. Nonsense, Carpathia had responded. Is there not a military leader in Israel with the fortitude to silence these two? The Israeli Prime Minister, who now reported to the Global Community Ambassador of the United States of Asia, was caught on microphone. Sir, we have become a weaponless society thanks to you. These two are weaponless as well, Carpathia had thundered. Subdue them. But Eli and Moshe continued to shout, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. The body of believers is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Carpathia, who had been merely trying to support his friends in Israel by honoring them for their new temple, asked the crowd, do you wish to listen to me or to them? The crowd had shouted, you, potent, you. There is no potentate but God himself, Eli responded. And Moshe added, your blood sacrifices shall turn to water, and your water drawing to blood. Buck had been there that day as the new publisher of the renamed Global Community Weekly. He resisted Carpathia's urging him to editorialize about what Nikolai called the intrusion of the two witnesses, and he persuaded the Global Community potent that the coverage could not ignore the facts. The blood let from the sacrificed heifer had indeed turned to water, and the water drawn in another ceremony turned to blood in the pail. The Israelis blamed the two witnesses for debasing their celebration. Buck hated the money he was making. Not even an outrageous salary could make his life easier. He had been forced to move back to New York. Much of the old guard at Global Community had been fired, including Stanton Bailey and Marge Potter, and even Jim Borland. Steve Plank was now publisher of the Global Community East Coast Daily Times, a newspaper born out of the merger of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. Though Steve wouldn't admit it, Buck believed the luster had faded from Steve's relationship to the potent, too. The only positive factor about Buck's new position was that he now had the means to isolate himself somewhat against the terrible crime wave that had broken all records in North America. Carpathia had used it to sway public opinion and get the populace behind the idea that the North American ambassador to the global community should supplant the sitting president. Gerald Fitzhugh and his vice president, were now headquartered in the old Executive Office Building in Washington, in charge of enforcing potent Carpathia's global disarmament plan in America. Buck's one act of resistance to Carpathia was to ignore the rumors about Fitzhugh plotting with the militia to oppose the global community regime by force. Buck was all for it and had secretly studied the feasibility of producing an anti-global community website on the internet. As soon as he could figure out a way to do it without it being traced back to his penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, he would do it. At least Buck had convinced potent Carpathia that Buck's moving to New Babylon would be a mistake. New York was still the world publishing capital after all. He was already heartbroken that Chloe's father was being required to relocate to New Babylon. The new city was palatial, but unless a person lived indoors 24 hours a day, the weather in Iraq was unbearable. And despite Carpathia's unparalleled popularity and his emphasis on the new one world government and one world religion, there were still enough vestiges of the old ways in the Middle East that a Western woman would feel totally out of place there. Buck had been thrilled at how Rayford and Amanda White had taken to each other. That took pressure off Buck and Chloe, wondering about the future, worrying about leaving her father alone if they were ever to marry. But how could Rayford expect an American woman to live in New Babylon? And how long could they live there before the potent began to step up his attacks on Christian believers? According to Bruce Barnes, the days of persecution were not far off. Buck missed Bruce more than he thought possible. Buck tried to see him every time he got back to Chicago to see Chloe. Anytime Bruce came through New York or they happened to run into each other in a foreign city, Bruce tried to make the time for a private study session. Bruce was fast becoming one of the leading prophecy scholars among new believers. The year or year had a half of peace. The year or year and a half of peace, he said, was fast coming to a close. Once the next three horsemen of the apocalypse appeared, 17 more judgments would come in rapid succession, leading to the glorious appearing of Christ 7 years from the signing of the covenant between Israel and the Antichrist. Bruce had become famous, even popular, but many believers were growing tired of his dire warnings. Rayford was going to be out of town until the day before he and Chloe and the new buyers were to close on the house. He smiled at the idea of a buyer securing a 30-year mortgage. Someone was going to lose on that deal. With Rayford gone, Chloe would be left with much of the work, selling stuff off, putting furniture into storage, and arranging with a moving company to ship her things to a local apartment and his all the way to Iraq. For the past couple of months, Amanda had been driving Rayford to O'Hara for these long trips. But she had recently taken a new position and couldn't get away. So today, Chloe would take Rayford by Amanda's new office where she was chief buyer for a retail clothier. When they had said their goodbyes, Chloe would drive him to the airport and bring the car back home. "So how's it going with you two?" Chloe asked in the car. "We're close." "I know you're close. That's obvious to everybody. Close to what is the question." "Close," he said. As they drove, Rayford's mind drifted to Amanda. Neither he nor Chloe had known what to make of her at first. A tall, handsome woman, a couple of years Rayford's senior. She had streaked hair and impeccable taste in clothes. A week after Rayford had returned from his first assignment, flying Global Community 1 to the Middle East, Bruce had introduced her to the Steeles after a Sunday morning service. Rayford was tired and none too happy about his reluctant decision to leave Pan Con for the employee of Nikolai Carpathia, and he was not really in the mood to be sociable. Mrs. White, however, seemed oblivious to Rayford and Chloe as people. To her, they had been just names associated with the former acquaintance, Irene Steele, who had left an indelible impression on her. Amanda had insisted on taking them to dinner that Sunday noon and was adamant about paying. Rayford had not felt much like talking, but that seemed not to be an issue for Amanda. She had a lot to say. "I've wanted to meet you, Captain Steele, because—" "Rayford, please." "Well, I'll call you Mr. Steele for now. Then, if Captain is too formal." Rayford is a little too familiar for me, though. That is what Irene called you. Anyway, she was the sweetest little woman, so soft spoken, so totally in love and devoted to you. She was the sole reason I came as close as I did to becoming a Christian before the rapture, and second only to the vanishings themselves. She was the reason I finally did come to the Lord. Then I couldn't remember her name, and none of the other ladies from that Bible study were still around. That made me feel lonely, as you can imagine. And I lost my family too. I'm sure Bruce told you, so it's been hard. Bruce has certainly been a godsend, though. Have you learned as much from him as I have? Well, of course you have. You've been with him for weeks. Eventually, Amanda slowed down and shared her own story of the loss of her family. We had been in a dead church all our lives. Then my husband got invited to some outing at a friend's church, came home, and insisted that we at least check out the Sunday services there. I don't mind telling you, I was not comfortable. They made a big deal all the time about being saved. Well, before I could get my little mind around the idea, I was the only one in my family who wasn't saved. To tell you the truth, the whole thing sounded a little white trashy to me. I didn't know I had a lot of pride. Lost people never know that, do they? Well, I pretended I was right there with my family, but they knew. They kept encouraging me to go to this woman's Bible study, so finally I went. I was just sure it was going to be more of the same frumpy middle aged women talking about sinners saved by grace. Somehow Amanda White managed to finish her meal while talking, but when she got to this part of her story, she clouded up and had to excuse herself for a few minutes. Chloe rolled her eyes. Dad, she said, what planet would you guess she's from? Rayford had chuckled. I do want to hear her impressions of your mother, he said. And she certainly sounds saved now, doesn't she? Yeah, but she's a long way from frumpy white trash. When Amanda returned, she apologized and said she was determined to get this said. Rayford smiled encouragingly at her while Chloe made faces at him behind her back, trying to get him to laugh. I'm not going to bother you anymore, she said. I'm an executive and not the type to insert myself into people's lives. I just wanted to get together with you one time to tell you what your wife and your mother meant in my life. You know, I had only one brief conversation with her. It came after that one meeting, and I was glad I got the chance to tell her how she had impressed me. If you're interested, I'll tell you about it. But if I've already rattled on too long, tell me that too. And I'll let you go with just the knowledge that Mrs. Steele was a wonderful lady. Rayford actually considered saying that they had had a tiring week and needed to get home, but he would never be that rude. Even Chloe would likely chastise him for a move like that, so he said, Oh, by all means, we'd love to hear it. The truth is, he added, I love to talk about Irene. Well, I don't know why I forgot her name for so long, because I was so struck by it at first. Besides sounding a little like iron and steel, I remember thinking that Irene sounded more like a name of someone many years older than your wife. She was about 40, right? Rayford nodded. Anyway, I took the morning off and I arrived at this home where the ladies were meeting that week. They all looked so normal and were wonderful to me. I noticed your wife right off. She was just radiant, friendly and smiling and talking with everyone. She welcomed me and asked about me. And then during the Bible study, prayer, and discussion, I was just impressed by her. What more can I say? A lot, Rayford hoped. But he didn't want to interview the woman. What had so impressed her? He was glad when Chloe jumped in. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. White, because I was never more impressed with my mother than after I had left home. I had always thought her a little too religious, too strict, too rigid. Only when we were apart did I realize how much I loved her because of how much she cared for me. Well, Amanda said, it was her own story that moved me. But more than that, it was her carriage, her countenance. I don't know if you knew this, but she had not been a Christian long either. Her story was the same as mine. She said her family had been going to church sort of perfunctorily for years, but when she found New Hope Village Church, she found Christ. There was a peace, a gentleness, a kindness, a serenity about her that I had never seen in anyone else. She had confidence, but she was humble. She was outgoing, yet not pushy or self promoting. I loved her immediately. She grew emotional when she talked about her family, and she said that her husband and her daughter were at the top of her prayer list. She loved you both so deeply. She said her greatest fear was that she would reach you too late and that you would not go to heaven with her and her son. I don't remember his name. Rayford Jr., Chloe said. She would have called him Ramey. After the meeting, I sought her out and told her that my family was the opposite. They were all worried that they would go to heaven without me. She told me how to receive Christ. I told her I wasn't ready, and she warned me not to put it off and said she would pray for me. That night, my family disappeared from their beds. Almost everyone was gone from our new church, including all the Bible study ladies. Eventually, I tracked down Bruce and asked if he knew Irene Steele. Rayford and Chloe had returned home and a little ashamed of themselves. That was nice, Rayford said. I'm glad we took the time for that. I just wish I hadn't been such a creep, Chloe said. For hardly having known her, that woman had a lot of insight into Mom. For nearly a year after that, Rayford saw Amanda White only on Sundays and at an occasional midweek meeting of the larger core study group. She was always cordial and friendly, but what impressed him most was her servant's attitude. She continually prayed for people, and she was busy in the church all the time. She studied, she grew, she learned, she talked to people about their standing with God. As Rayford watched her from afar, she became more and more attractive to him. One Sunday, he told Chloe, "You know, we never reciprocated on Amanda White's dinner invitation." "You want to have her over?" Chloe asked. "I want to ask her out." "Pardon me?" "You heard me." "Dad, you mean like a date?" "A double date with you and Buck." Chloe had laughed, then apologized. "It's not funny. I'm just surprised." "Don't make a big deal of it," he said. "I just might ask her." "Don't you make a big deal of it," Chloe said. Buck was not surprised when Chloe told him her dad wanted them to double date with Amanda White. "I wondered when he'd get around to it." "To dating?" "To dating Amanda White. You noticed something there. You never said anything." "I didn't want to risk you mentioning it and planting an idea in his head that wasn't his own." "That rarely happens." "Anyway, I think they'll be good for each other," Buck said. "He needs companionship his own age. And if something comes of it, so much the better." "Why?" "Because he's not going to want to be alone if we decide to get more serious." "Seems to me we've already decided." Chloe slipped her hand into Buck's. "I just don't know what to do about timing and geography with everything breaking the way it has." Buck was hoping for some hint from Chloe that she would be willing to follow him anywhere, that she was either ready for marriage or that she needed more time. Time was getting away from them, but still Buck hesitated. "I'm ready when he is," Chloe told Rayford, "but I'm not going to say a word." "Why not?" Rayford said. "Men need a few signals." "He's getting all the signals he needs." "So you've held his hand by now?" "Dad!" "Bet you've even kissed him." "No comment." "That's a yes if I ever heard one." "Like I said, he's getting all the signals he needs." In fact, Buck would never forget the first time he had kissed Chloe. It had been the night he left for New York by car, about a year before. Carpathia had bought up the weekly as well as any of the competition worth working for, and Buck seemed to have less choice than ever over his own career. He could try bootlegging copy over the internet, but he still needed to make a living. And Bruce, who was at the church less and less all the time due to his ministry all over the world, had encouraged him to stay with Global Weekly even after the name was changed to Global Community Weekly. "I wish we could change the last word one more time," Buck said, "to weekly, Weakly. Buck had resigned himself to doing the best he could for the kingdom of God, just as Chloe's father had done, but he still hid his identity as a believer. Whatever freedom and perceived objectivity he had would soon be gone if that truth was known to Carpathia. That last night in Chicago, he and Chloe were in his apartment packing the last of his personal things. His plan was to leave by 9 o'clock that night and drive all the way to New York City in one marathon stretch. As they worked, they talked about how much they would hate being apart, how much they would miss each other, how often they would phone and email each other. I wish you could come with me, Buck said at one point. Yeah, that would be appropriate, she said. Someday, he said. Someday what? But he would not bite. He carried a box to the car and came back in, passing her as she taped another. Tears ran down her face. What's this? He said, stopping to wipe her face with his fingers. Don't get me started now. You'll never miss me as much as I'll miss you, she said, trying to continue to work with him, hovering a hand on her face. Stop it, he whispered. Come here. She set down the tape and stood to face him. He embraced her and pulled her close. Her hands were at her sides and her cheeks was on his chest. They had held each other before and they had walked hand in hand, sometimes arm in arm. They had expressed their deep feelings for each other without mentioning love, and they had agreed not to cry and not to say anything rash in the moment of parting. We'll see each other often, he said. You'll rendezvous with your dad when he comes through New York, and I'll have reasons to come here. What reason? The Chicago office is closing. This reason, he said, holding her tighter, and she began to sob. I'm sorry, she said. This is going to be so hard. I know. No, you don't, Buck. You can't say you care for me as much as I care for you. Buck had already planned his first kiss. He had hoped to find a reason to simply brush her lips with his at the end of an evening, say good night, and slip away. He didn't want to have to deal with her reaction or deal with kissing her again just then. It was going to be meaningful and special, but quick and simple, something they could build on later. But now he wanted her to know how he felt. He was angry at himself for being so good at writing, but so incompetent at telling her to her face how much she meant to him. He stepped back and took her face in his hands. She resisted at first and tried to hide her face in his chest again, but he insisted she look at him. I don't ever want to hear you say that again, he said. But Buck, it's true. He lowered his head until his eyes were inches from hers. Did you hear me? He said. Don't say it again. Don't imply it. Don't even think it. There's no possible way you could care for me more than I care for you. You are my whole life. I love you, Chloe. Don't you know that? He felt her nearly recoil at that first declaration of his love. Her tears rolled over her hands and she began to say, how would I? But he lowered his mouth to hers, cutting off her words, and it was no quick touch of the lips. She raised her hands between her arms. She raised her hands between her arms, wrapped them around his neck, and held him tight as they kissed. She pulled away briefly and whispered, Did you only say that because you're leaving? And but he covered her mouth again with his. A moment later, he touched her nose with the tip of his own and said, Don't doubt my love for you ever again, promise? But Buck, promise? I promise, and I love you too, Buck. Rayford was not sure just when his respect and admiration for Amanda White had developed into love. He had grown fond of her, liked her, loved being with her. They had become comfortable enough with each other to touch each other when they spoke, to hold hands to embrace. But when he found himself missing her after only a day away and needing to call her when he was gone more than a few days, he knew something was developing. She actually started kissing Rayford before he kissed her, twice when he returned to Chicago after several days away. Amanda greeted him with a hug and a peck on the cheek. He had liked it, but had also been embarrassed. But the third time he returned from such a trip, she merely embraced him and did not attempt to kiss him. His timing had been perfect. He had decided that if she tried to kiss him on the cheek this time, he would turn and take it on the lips. He had brought her a gift from Paris, an expensive necklace. When she did not try to kiss him, he just held her embrace longer and said, Come here a minute. As passengers and crew passed them in the corridor, Rayford had Amanda sit next to him in the waiting area. It was awkward with an armrest between them. Both were bundled up, Amanda in a fur coat and Rayford with his uniform coat over his arm. He pulled the jewelry box from the sack in his flight bag. "This is for you." Amanda, knowing where he had been, made a big deal over the bag, the name of the store, and the box. Finally, she opened it and appeared to stop breathing. It was a magnificent piece, gold with diamonds. "Rayford," she said, "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," he said, and he took her in his arms, the package in her hands nearly crushed between them, and kissed her. "I still don't know what to say," she said with a twinkle in her eye, and he kissed her again. Now, 2 weeks before his move to New Babylon, Rayford had been on the phone with Buck more often than Chloe had. While she was warming up the car, he sneaked in one last call. "Everything set?" he asked Buck. "Everything. I'll be there." "Good." In the car, he asked Chloe, "What's the status on your apartment?" "They promised it'll be ready," she said, "but I'm getting a little skittish because they keep stalling me on the paperwork." "You're going to be all right here with me in New Babylon and Buck in New York." "It's not my first choice, but I have no interest living anywhere near Carpathia and certainly not in Iraq." "What's Buck saying?" "I haven't been able to reach him today. He must be on assignment somewhere. I know he wanted to see Fitzhugh in D.C. soon." "Yeah, maybe that's where he is." Chloe stopped at Amanda's clothing store in Des Plaines and waited in the car as Rayford hurried in to say goodbye. "Is he here?" he asked her secretary. "He is, and she is," the secretary said. "She's in her office, and he's in that one." She pointed to a smaller office next to Amanda's. "As soon as I'm in there, would you run out to the car and tell my daughter she has a call she can take in there?" "Sure." Rayford knocked and entered Amanda's office. "I hope you're not expecting me to be cheery, Ray," she said. "I've been trying to work up a smile all day, and it's not working." "Let me see what I can do to make you smile," he said, pulling her from her chair and kissing her. "You know Buck's here," she said. "Yeah, it'll be a nice surprise for Chloe." "Are you going to come and surprise me like that sometime?" "Maybe I'll surprise you right now," he said. "How do you like your new job?" "I hate it. I'd leave in a New York minute if the right guy came along." "The right guy just came along," Rayford said, slipping a small box from his side pocket and pressing it into Amanda's back. She pulled away. "What is that?" "What, this? I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" Buck had heard Rayford outside the door and knew Chloe wouldn't be far behind. He turned the light off and felt his way back to the chair behind the desk. In a few minutes he heard Chloe. "I'm here," she said. "Yes, ma'am," the secretary said. "Line 1." The door opened slowly and Chloe turned on the light. She jumped when she saw Buck behind the desk, then squealed and ran to him. As soon as he stood, she leaped into his arms and he held her, twirling her around. "Shh," he said. "This is a business." "Did Daddy know about this?" "Of course he did. He had to." "He knew," Buck said. "Surprise?" "Of course. What are you doing in town? How long can you stay? What are we doing?" "I'm in town only to see you. I leave on a red-eye tonight for Washington, and we're going to dinner after we drop your dad off at the airport." "Yeah? You came only to see me? I told you a long time ago to never doubt my love for you." "I know." He turned and lowered her into the chair he had been sitting in, then knelt before her and pulled a ring box from his pocket. "Oh, Ray," Amanda said, gazing at the ring on her finger, "I love you. And for the few years we have left, I will love being yours." "There's one more thing," he said. "What?" "Buck and I have been talking. He's proposing in the next room right now. And we were wondering if you two might be open to a double ceremony with Bruce officiating." Rayford wondered how she would react. She and Chloe were friends, but not close. That would be wonderful. But Chloe might not go for it, so let's leave it up to her. No hard feelings either way. If she wants her own day, fine, but I love the idea. "When?" "The day before we close on the house. You give 2 weeks' notice here and move with me to New Babylon." "Rayford still," she said. "It takes a while to get your temperature up, but not long to make you boil. I'll write my resignation before your plane leaves the ground." "Have you wondered why you never got the paperwork on the apartment?" Buck asked. Chloe nodded. because that deal's not going to happen. If you'll have me, I want you to move in with me in New York. Rayford, Amanda said, I didn't think I would ever be truly happy again, but I am. A double ceremony, Chloe swiped at her tears. I'd love it. But do you think Amanda will stand for it? And that's the end of chapter 18. And I hope you enjoyed that. Have a wonderful day, and you're free to go.